Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're navigating a really complex chapter from Gray's Anatomy, the 42nd edition. We're going to give you that essential visualization-friendly walkthrough of the male reproductive system.
It really is. It's a study in some highly optimized engineering. And we're not just talking about the gonads, the testes, but the whole intricate transport network.
And all the glands that go with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The robust accessory sex glands like the prostate, the seminal glands, and the external structures. Functionally, the system is really doing two critical things: reproduction through spermatogenesis and fluid production, and development via steroidogenesis.
Exactly. So our mission today is to basically give you a mental map of the system. We'll break down the anatomical relationships, the layers, and especially some of the unique vascular pathways. By the end, you should be able to visualize the whole assembly, focusing on the details that have, the highest clinical relevance. So let's start with the cornerstone, the testes itself.
Right. So structurally, the adult testis is pretty consistent in size. We're talking around 4 to 5 centimeters long, and a volume that's typically between 15 and 25 milliliters.
And they're suspended in the scrotum by the spermatic cord.
They are. And a great detail for visualization. They're positioned obliquely. The superior pole, it points a little anterolaterally, and the inferior pole anteromedially. Oh, and the left testis often settles just a bit lower than the right.
That slight asymmetry is interesting, but really, the positioning outside the body is the functional masterpiece here. It's designed entirely around temperature. What's the mechanism the source material highlights as being absolutely vital?
It is all about maintaining an environment that's 3 to 4 degrees Celsius below core body temperature. The scrotum's location and skin help, of course, but the real structural genius is inside the spermatic cord. It's the pampiniform plexus. This dense network of veins, which I'm sure we'll get into more, it facilitates this crucial countercurrent heat exchange.
Okay, so to really understand how the testes functions and how it can fail, we need to picture the layers surrounding it. Let's trace those envelopes from the outside in toward the core.
Okay, so moving inward, the first thing you'd encounter is the tunica vaginalis. It's a double-layered serous sac, actually a remnant of the fetal processus vaginalis. It has a visceral layer stuck to the testis and a parietal layer lining the scrotum.
So it lets the testis move freely.
Exactly. And then underneath that, you get to the powerhouse layer, the tunica albuginea.
The tunica albuginea, that just sounds like a fortress. What's it made of?
It is. It's a thick, incredibly dense blue-white layer. It's mostly collagen fibers. That's what gives the testes its shape and rigidity. And importantly, it projects inward posteriorly to form the mediastinum of the testis. That's the central hub for all the vessels and ducts.
And the deepest layer.
Deepest of all is the tunica vasculosa, which is basically a meshwork of blood vessels and connective tissue lining the internal partitions.
Okay, so if we go back to that outermost layer, the tunica vaginalis, this is where anatomy really dictates some common pathologies. If that fetal connection, the processus vaginalis, doesn't fully seal off, what clinical concerns immediately pop up?
Well, failure of obliteration means you have a persistent potential communication channel, right, between the peritoneal cavity and the scrotum. And that anatomical defect is the basis for a communicating hydrocele.
So fluid accumulating in the tunica vaginalis.
Right. And crucially, for indirect inguinal hernias, where, abdominal contents can follow that same path down, and even if that duct does obliterate, you can still get hydroceles if there's lymphatic obstruction, maybe from inflammation or neoplastic conditions.
That connection between development and later surgical issues is just a huge takeaway. Okay, let's follow the blood. The source material emphasizes a really robust 3-part arterial supply.
It does. The majority of the supply, about 2/3 of it, is delivered by the testicular artery, which is a very long vessel that originates way up high from the aorta. The rest is shared by the smaller artery to the ductus deferens in the cremasteric artery. It's a redundant system, which ensures a continuous supply.
So if the arterial supply is robust, the venous drainage is, well, it's truly unique. This is where that temperature mechanism lives, in the pampiniform plexus. Can you describe its structure and design?
The pampiniform plexus is just fascinating. It's this intricate network of veins that completely envelops and surrounds the testicular artery as it goes up through the spermatic cord. By having this massive venous surface area right up against the artery, heat gets transferred very efficiently.
From the warm arterial blood
To the cooler venous blood that's returning from the scrotum. It's a perfectly designed countercurrent heat exchange system.
But that plexus, it consolidates into a single vein on each side, and their final destinations are dramatically asymmetrical. This matters immensely, clinically. Walk us through that difference.
Indeed. On the right side, the right testicular vein drains at a very shallow and acute angle directly into the inferior vena cava, the IVC. It's a hydrodynamically efficient path. It's easy.
But the left side is different.
Very different. The left testicular vein is longer, and it drains into the left renal vein at a pronounced right angle.
And why does that distinction matter so much when we talk about pathology?
Well, that sharp right angle and the greater lengths on the left side, they're widely accepted as the primary anatomical reasons why varicoceles happen far more frequently on the left.
Varicoceles being those enlarged, incompetent veins.
Exactly. The palpable swelling. The venous pressure gradient on the left is just less favorable, making drainage against gravity much more difficult.
That is a crystal clear link. Okay, let's quickly note the retroperitoneal path for the lymphatics. It's important to remember that the drainage follows the vessels way up into the body.
That's correct. Lymphatic drainage is vertical, and it goes primarily to the lateral aortic and lateral cable nodes high in the retroperitoneum. This is crucial because it dictates where cancer cells metastasize first. They don't go to the lower inguinal nodes unless the scrotal skin itself is involved.
And innervation.
Innervation is similar. It's visceral, traveling from the T10, T11 segments via the renal and aortic plexuses.
All right, let's dive into the internal factory. So that tough tunica albuginea sends septations inward, creating the structure. How complex is it inside?
It divides the testis into about 250 distinct lobules, and inside these lobules are the seminiferous tubules, and this is where the sheer scale of the system just hits you.
How so?
There are 600 to 1,200 of these tubules per testis. If you uncoil them all, the total length is about 250 meters. That's basically 2.5 football fields of tightly coiled piping, making up 80% of the testes volume.
That is a staggering length of tubing, just dedicated to production. And within that huge space, what are the two main cell types, and what's the specific job of the one that acts as a gatekeeper?
Okay, so the first type is the interstitial endocrine cells, or Leydig cells. They live outside the tubules, and they are the testosterone synthesis factory.
And inside the tube.
That's where you find the Sertoli cells, the nurse cells, and they are absolutely indispensable. They form these specialized tight junctions with each other, creating the blood-testis barrier.
A barrier against what?
Against the body's own immune system. Spermatogenesis introduces new cell surface proteins, and this barrier shields the developing sperm from being seen as foreign and attacked. They also provide all the support needed for that whole 64-day process of sperm production.
Okay, so once production is done, how do these cells get out? What's the exit path?
It's very specific flow. From the coiled seminiferous tubules, sperm move into short tubuli recti. Those then feed into this anastomosing network of channels called the retestis. It's in the retestis that a lot of the fluid is reabsorbed, concentrating the sperm. Finally, 7 to 15 efferent ductules pierce the tunica albuginea and lead the sperm out.
Out into the epididymis. And as they get there, that final shaping process, spermatogenesis, is happening. What are the key features of that transformation into a mature spermatozoon?
They really need three things to be successful. First, the acrosomal cap forms over the head. It's full of enzymes needed to penetrate the egg. Second, the tail, or axonum, develops. And third, they concentrate mitochondria really tightly into the midpiece. This is the cellular powerhouse that's going to provide all the energy needed for motility.
So this structurally mature but still non-motile sperm then enters the epididymis, which wraps around the back and side of the testis. Beyond just absorbing fluid, what key functional transformation happens here?
The epididymis is this single, incredibly long coiled tubule. We're talking 3 to 4 meters long. And it's where sperm gain effective motility. Its epithelium resorbs about 90% of the remaining fluid. But critically, as sperm travel to the head, body, and tail, their movement pattern changes. It goes from these low-frequency, high-amplitude movements to the high-frequency, low-amplitude propulsion you need for efficient forward progression. It's basically the sperm's training ground.
After training, they get on the high-speed transit system, the ductus deferens, or vas deferens, about 35 centimeters long. What's its defining muscular characteristic?
Yeah, this is a fascinating structural detail. The ductus deferens has the greatest muscle-to-lumen ratio, about 10 to 1 of any hollow organ in the body. It's basically a thick, three-layered sheath of smooth muscle around a tiny lumen. And that thick wall is necessary because it contracts with enormous force and speed during ejaculation.
The ductus deferens then dilates into the ampulla before it joins the duct of the seminal gland, forming the short ejaculatory duct. Which brings us to the accessory glands that provide most of the fluid. Let's start with the biggest contributors, the seminal glands.
Right. The paired seminal glands, which are often misleadingly called seminal vesicles. They're at the base of the prostate. They are the major fluid producers, contributing at least 2/3 of the total ejacular volume. And this fluid is critical.
What are the key things they provide and why?
Well, fructose is the big one. It's the primary energy source for the sperm's mitochondria. It fuels that motility we just talked about. They also provide coagulation proteins, which help the semen temporarily clot after emission, and prostaglandins, which are thought to help with muscular contraction in the female reproductive tract.
And what about the smaller but equally crucial lubricating glands?
There we have the bulbo-urethral glands, or Cowper's glands. They're small, located near the membranous urethra. Their secretion is a clear mucus, about 5 to 10% of the total volume, and importantly, it's released before ejaculation. Its job is to lubricate the urethra and neutralize any residual acidic urine. Along the spongy urethra, you have the periurethral glands doing a similar job.
Okay, finally, let's look at the external structure. The penis has the attached root and the free body. We have 3 columns of erectile tissue, the 2 paired corpora cavernosa on top, and the single ventral corpus spongiosum that houses the urethra.
And the structure is really defined by its fascial covering. All 3 columns are encased together by the dense, deep fascia of the penis, or Buck's fascia.
And let's circle back to a point we made earlier, that rigid collagen sheath around the individual corpora cavernosa. Why is that rigidity so important during erection?
That rigid layer is the tunica albuginea of the corpora cavernosa. And it's everything. See, erection is initiated by parasympathetic input releasing nitric oxide. This causes the smooth muscle inside the corpora to relax. Blood then rushes in via the Hilacine arteries, filling the cavernous spaces. And as the volume increases, that rigid tunica albuginea acts like a fixed container.
And that containment is what leads to the essential mechanism, isn't it?
Precisely. The swelling corporal tissue compresses the small emissary veins against that unyielding tunica albuginea, which effectively prevents venous outflow. This is the critical veno-occlusive mechanism. It traps the blood and results in a rigid erection.
And the final act, the 2-part process of emission and ejaculation.
Emission getting the fluid into the prostatic urethra, that's managed by the sympathetic nervous system, from T11 to L1. Ejaculation, the forceful expulsion, involves a few things at once. Autonomic closure of the bladder neck to stop retrograde flow, and somatic reflex contractions of the bulbus spongiosus muscle for the propulsive force.
Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, let's touch on those high-yield clinical correlations the source highlights. What about cryptorchidism?
That's an undescended testis, seen in about 3% of full-term infants, and it carries a significant lifelong risk for both infertility and testicular cancer. What's anatomically interesting is that while the Leydig's cell functions so, testosterone production often stays normal, the higher temperature immediately causes Sertoli cell degeneration in childhood, and it permanently impairs the ability to produce viable sperm.
And the big emergency that requires immediate action.
Testicular torsion, rotation around the blood supply, which leads to rapid ischemia. The window for salvaging the tissue is very narrow, typically 4 to 6 hours, making it an absolute surgical emergency. And we also mentioned how the persistent processus vaginalis can lead to those communicating hydroceles or cysts of the spermatic cord.
This whole system, from the temperature regulation of the pampiniform plexus to the muscular power of the ductus deferens, it's just a marvelous specialization.
It is. The delicate balance required for normal function is just evident everywhere you look.
As we close this deep dive, let's consider the final thought from the source material. It notes that age-related changes sclerosis in the seminiferous tubules, a decline in sperm quality, can become notable as early as the 3rd or 4th decade of life. What stands out to you when you consider how the anatomy tries, but eventually struggles, to maintain this high level of function over a lifetime?
I mean, what stands out is just how tightly coupled the function is to the structure. That sclerosis of the seminiferous tubules you mentioned essentially reduces that 250-meter factory capacity. Once that high-density organization starts to degrade, even if the Leydig cells are still producing hormones, the ability of the Sertoli cells to sustain full-scale, high-quality spermatogenesis just declines. It really demonstrates that peak efficiency requires the integrity of every single coiled element.
A profound thought on which to end. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the unique architecture of the male reproductive system. We hope you feel far better equipped to navigate the anatomy of this chapter.